It's before dawn. You can see your breath above the bed. The fire in the great hall died hours ago. The water in the jug by the window has a thin skin of ice. The stone wall beside your head feels damp. You're not outside, you're inside one of the grandest buildings of your century, a stone castle built by a lord. And even when the fires were roaring last night in a hearth big enough to walk into, this place barely climbed above the chill of a cellar. This was winter for most of human history. There was no thermostat, no switch, no warm air whispering out of a vent in the floor. And yet, for 1,000 years, across frozen forests and windswept hills, they did more than endure it. They built entire ways of living around it. So how did they do it? The answer runs through clever engineering, strange daily habits, shared body heat, and one quiet invention that rebuilt the home from the inside out. Let me show you. In the early Middle Ages, almost every home was heated the same way. Peasant hut, lord's hall, same method. One open hearth, a fire built directly on the floor, in the middle of the room, no chimney. Smoke rose, drifted, and escaped through a hole in the roof, or just leaked out through the thatch. Sounds cozy. It wasn't. The fire was the center of everything, yes. It cooked the food, dried the wet clothes, gave the light, drew the household into one warm circle. But the air was thick, stinging. Researchers who studied people living in reconstructed, smoky houses found real damage to the lungs, the kind you'd expect from breathing wood smoke every day for years. And there was an engineering problem. To stop the sparks from setting the roof alight, the ceilings had to be high, and heat rises, so most of the warmth pooled uselessly in the rafters, far above the people who needed it. The same roof vents that let the smoke out let the heat out with it. The early medieval hall was a cold, dim, smoky room. People crowded close to the flames because 3 steps away the warmth was gone. Built for survival, optimized for nothing. Now we get to the turning point. The single thing that did more to change life indoors than almost anything else. It wasn't grand, it wasn't expensive, it wasn't an invention by a famous man. It was the chimney. A built-in channel carries smoke up, out through a flue. That's it. It seems too simple to matter, but it solved both great problems of the open hearth at the same time. You could push the fire against an outside wall, the smoke had its own escape route, and because the flames now sat in a recess, a fireplace, far less heat shot straight up into the void. The shift gathered momentum in the 12th century. One of the earliest surviving chimneys in England sits in Conisbrough Castle in South Yorkshire, built around 1185. Some of the earliest ones elsewhere were crude, wood, sticks packed with mud and clay, an obvious fire risk, before the builders moved to brick and stone. But the engineering isn't the interesting part. The interesting part is what the chimney did to how people lived. Without those soaring, smoke-venting ceilings, rooms could be built lower, smaller, and a small room with a fireplace held its heat far better than a cavernous hall ever did. The great communal hall, where everyone had once huddled around one fire, began to break apart. You could now heat a private bedchamber, a small study off to one side, a room for one family. Historians estimate that the move from open hearth to fireplace cut the number of people gathered around a single warm fire by about 3/4. Think about what that means. The chimney didn't just vent smoke, it broke the village into rooms. The house stopped being a shelter, it became a place where private life could happen, where you could read in winter, work in winter, live in winter. A carved stone fireplace also became a statement of wealth. The greatest households would heat a single hall with several at once. Warmth was turning into something you could measure and display. Old ways aren't magic, they're physics. We like to imagine the Middle Ages as one place, one way of doing things. Wrong. Medieval Europe stretched from frozen Scandinavia to the warm Mediterranean. The fight against cold looked completely different depending on where you stood. In the north, among the Vikings and the peoples of the cold forests, the answer was the long fire, an extended hearth running down the middle of a communal hall. Families gathered along benches on either side. It fed many people, many cooking pots at once, but it carried every weakness of the open hearth: smoky, hard to warm a large room. In France, as the chimney took hold, people learned to sit with their backs to grand wall-mounted fireplaces, often projecting out into the room as showpieces. But the truly clever solution came from somewhere else. In the German-speaking lands, Germany, Austria, Switzerland, they built something called the Kachelofen, a tiled stove. Not an open flame, an enclosed masonry stove, clad in ceramic tiles. The fire was lit inside it, sometimes fed from a doorway in the next room, so no smoke or ash entered the living space. The hot gases were forced through a maze of internal channels, soaking the heat into the heavy brick and tile. A good Kachelofen weighs between 1 and 5 tons. A good Kachelofen could keep a room warm for 6 to 12 hours after the wood went out. Now think about an open fireplace. It roasts your front while your back freezes. The Kachelofen radiated heat evenly, slowly, from every wall of the stove, soaking it back out for half a day after the wood was gone. Potters made the tiles into works of art. A fine Kachelofen was a heater and a treasure. One thread reaches back even further. The Romans had built underfloor heating, hypocausts. A furnace pushed hot air through channels beneath the floor. That knowledge never entirely vanished. In some medieval monasteries and grand buildings, versions of it survived. In some places, the old hypocaust even merged with early stove technology. The warmth of a medieval monastery could be, quite literally, an echo of Rome. 500 years ago, they understood thermal mass better than a modern builder pouring a slab of insulated foam. None of these fires meant anything without fuel. And fuel was a constant, serious worry. Warmth wasn't something you bought, it was something you cut, dried, carried, hoarded, by hand. For most of Europe, the answer was wood. But here's a number that should stop you. Between the years 1000 and 1300, the population of Europe roughly tripled. Demand for firewood exploded. Forests were being cleared for farmland at the same time. So they managed the wood on purpose. They coppiced, cutting trees close to the ground so they sent up fast-growing shoots to harvest again and again. They pollard, cutting the high branches out of reach of grazing animals. These were carefully tended fuel farms, not random woods. Where the trees ran out, they burned whatever the land gave them. In the bogs of Ireland, the Netherlands, parts of Britain, they cut and dried peat. In drier regions, dung, crop stalks. In certain districts, mineral coal was already being dug as early as the 13th century, long before the great industrial age of coal. And charcoal, wood burned slowly with little air, burned hotter, essential for serious heat, for smelting iron. Because fuel was heavy and hard to move, energy was deeply local. You burned what grew near you. Gathering it and preparing it was relentless year-round labor, and the fear of running out before spring was real. A fuel store that ran low in February wasn't an inconvenience, it was a matter of survival. Every fire stood for hours of someone's work. That shaped how carefully and how communally they used their warmth. Time was an ingredient, so was sweat. If you couldn't reliably heat the room, the next best thing was to heat the body. And here, medieval people excelled. Their clothing was a personal heating system, portable, layered, and they understood it better than we tend to assume. The foundation was wool and linen. Linen against the skin, soft, breathable. Over it, wool, an outstanding insulator, traps warm air, keeps you warm even when it gets damp, which mattered enormously in a wet winter. And they knew sweat was the enemy. Damp wool from your own perspiration loses its insulating power, so a worker peeled off a layer as he heated up, put it back on as he cooled. The exact same trick modern outdoor brands now sell you as a revolution in technical apparel. A winter wardrobe was a system. A man might wear a linen shirt, a woolen coat, a coif, a snug cap tied under the chin, a hood pulled over the top, draping across the shoulders. Gloves often had 2 fingers and a thumb, or were simply mittens, wool or padded leather, keeping the fingers together so they could share warmth. The wealthy lined their garments with fur. The peasants used rougher skins where they could. On the feet, raised wooden overshoes called pattens lifted precious leather shoes out of the freezing mud. The result? Even in an unheated room, a well-dressed person was a walking bundle of trapped warm air. The same principle, wool layered against the body, is stitched into the high-tech jacket sitting in your closet right now. You call it innovation. They called it Tuesday. If clothing was the daytime defense, the real battle came at night. The medieval bed became a small fortress. For the poorest, it was a pile of straw on the floor, whatever covering you could find. Anyone better off built up the bed in stages. First, a wooden frame strung with a lattice of ropes. The ropes needed regular tightening as they sagged. Then a mattress sack stuffed in a clear hierarchy of comfort. Straw at the bottom, then grass, then an herb actually called bed straw, then wool, and feathers and down at the very top. Over that went linen sheets, woolen blankets, furs, quilts. The finest beds were enclosed by heavy curtains. We think of those as decoration, privacy. Their first job was thermal. Pull them shut and your own body heat slowly warms the small pocket of trapped air inside. The bed becomes a tent inside the room. You may have heard the slack ropes gave us the phrase, "sleep tight," almost certainly a charming myth. The saying only appears in writing in the 19th century, long after rope beds. Tight just meant soundly. They had other tricks. They heated stones or bricks by the fire and tucked them under the covers. Wealthier households by the Tudor period used a metal bed warmer, a lidded pan of hot coals on a long handle, run between the sheets just before bed. Almost everyone wore a cap to bed to stop the heat escaping from the head. And there was warmth in numbers. Beds were shared by whole families, by siblings, by servants, even by strangers at an inn, where guests slept on their own half of the mattress, with real etiquette about being a considerate bedfellow. On the coldest days, the smartest move was simply not to get up. The wealthy received visitors from bed, partly because it was the warmest spot in the house. Convenient, fragile, that's the modern bedroom. Theirs was the opposite. There's one more source of heat we'd find strange today: animals. In parts of Britain, especially Wales and the north of England, and across other regions of Europe, they built the longhouse, also called the byre house. Humans and livestock under one roof, divided only by a passage. People at the upper end, cattle at the lower end. The floor sloped away to drain the waste. This became more common around the 13th century as part of a wider move to bring livestock under cover for the winter. The documented reason was to shelter valuable animals and manage their waste. But there was a built-in bonus. A barn full of cattle is, quite literally, a source of heat. A single cow gives off a surprising amount of warmth, A group of them in an enclosed space would have raised the temperature noticeably. It's reasonable to think the people at the warm end of the building were quietly borrowing their animals' body heat. The smell and the mess as the price, the warmth as the reward. People shared warmth with each other just as deliberately. In the harshest winters, this very likely went further. Travelers in cold rural corners of Europe, in centuries closer to our own, described how people more or less shut down for the depths of winter. Long hours in bed, packed together, partly to stay warm, partly to eat less when food was scarce. Those accounts come after the medieval period, so we can't point to a chronicle and say, a village did this in the year 1300. But given the chronic fuel shortages and the empty, dark stretch of the farming year, it's reasonable to think something similar, a kind of human near hibernation, was a sensible survival strategy long before anyone wrote it down. The monastery had its own answer. Monks lived austere lives. Most of the monastery, including the cloister where they worked, was unheated. But there was one important exception, the calefactory, the warming house. A communal fire was kept burning there so the monks could thaw out after long, freezing hours of study. In the early Middle Ages, it was one of only a handful of heated rooms, alongside the kitchen, the infirmary, the guest house. It usually sat near the dining hall, so the warmth could be shared at meals. The room above it was sometimes used to store the monastery's documents, safe from the damp. They didn't have central heating, they had priorities. Beyond fires, clothes, beds, and bodies, they kept a whole toolkit of smaller tricks. Take the tapestries we admire on castle walls. They were art, they also had a job. Bare stone radiates cold, feels damp. A thick woven hanging puts a barrier of cloth and trapped air between the cold wall and the room, softens the drafts creeping through the gaps. Windows were another battle. Glass was rare and expensive. Ordinary windows were kept small, closed with wooden shutters rather than panes. A small shuttered window let in far less biting air than a large one, even if it left the room dark. In winter, warmth won. The floors did some work too, strewn with rushes or straw, a little insulation underfoot. They soaked up the damp and the mess, could be swept out and replaced when they got too foul. Put it all together, the tapestries on the walls, the shutters on the windows, the rushes on the floor, the curtains around the bed, the layers on the body. The real strategy comes clear. They couldn't warm a whole house, so they fought on every front at once. They trapped heat where they made it, and they shrank the space they needed to keep warm down to the smallest possible pocket. Not nostalgia, just physics. Look closely. Almost all of it is still here, mostly unnoticed. The layering behind your winter coat, medieval. The hood on a raincoat is a direct descendant of the medieval cloak. The merino base layer sold today as cutting-edge gear does the exact job that medieval wool always did. In the cold heart of Central Europe, the Kachelofen is still built, still loved, prized for the same slow warmth that made it valuable 500 years ago. What broke the pattern was central heating, the ability to warm a whole building with the turn of a dial. It arrived only very recently, and it did something we rarely stop to think about. It quietly erased an entire dimension of daily life, the constant physical work of staying warm that had shaped homes, habits, and entire societies for thousands of years. Modern heating is convenient. It's also fragile. Cut the power for 48 hours in January and a modern house turns into a tomb. A medieval house with its small rooms, thick walls, layered bodies, and shared beds would have shrugged. We didn't get warmer, we got dependent. So the next time the heating cuts out for a few hours in the depth of winter and the cold starts pressing back in through the walls, recognize the feeling for what it is, for almost everyone who came before you, that wasn't an emergency. That was just January.